Okay, good morning. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Giuseppe Veltri. I'm a social psychologist working at the University of Trento. I'm back in Italy after many years abroad. In the meantime, something called Brexit happened, so make me reconsider where to work. And I think when I was preparing this talk, I really used the chance to think about aspects of behavioral research that I think are interesting for the near future. But before doing that, I think I would spend just 5 minutes to talk again about what we do in behavioral research, simply because it's important to understand what we're doing here. The main point that Cristiano already mentioned is the fact that our idea of how people think has changed. The way how people take decisions has changed. In the past, there was this very, I suppose, positive idea. Well, positive, let's say, extremely positive in the sense that it was reducing the way how people take decisions to the idea of the rational man. The idea that we consider all aspects when we take a decision, and then we take this decision based on a careful evaluation of all the information we have. And a lot of psychological research went into demonstrating that that's not the case. We do that, we are careful, we are rational, but we also are something else. Because we deal with a world that is very complex, we have to take decisions in a much faster way. And one way of doing this is using what Cristiano has defined heuristics, which are simply some mental rules, shortcuts that help us to take decisions quickly. I'll give you an example. Let's say now it's summer, you're going on a trip, you're a tourist, you end up in a nice village. You're looking for a place to go for lunch. You're in the middle of the road and there are 2 restaurants. One on the left and one on the right. The parking lot of the one on the right is full of cars. The other one is empty. Which one do you choose? The full one. This is an example of a heuristic. It's called social proof. You will pick up the restaurant which has much more validation socially by other people. It is necessary logic to follow that that is the better restaurant. No, not really. It could be, for example, that they're celebrating something. So it's full of people because of that. So it doesn't mean that that is the best restaurant. This is an example how we use these mental rules and shortcuts to take decisions. And sometimes, I mean, most of the time they're useful, but sometimes they make us make some mistakes. These mistakes are called biases because they're systematic. It happens all over again. Now, how that came to be important? Well, in the domain in which myself and Cristiano and Paco and others we have worked, we worked for an organism, the European Commission, that had to do policy. But in order to do policy, you need to have an understanding how people behave, because otherwise you might design policy in the wrong way. So any policy has an implicit model of how people behave. And if that model is wrong, the policy doesn't work. And I'll give you another example, because usually examples get the message. This is from a real study done in Israel a few years ago. A very nice paper that is called A Fine is a Price. The story is about a school where there were children and parents. And the problem of the school was that parents, they were dropping their children too late. So the school could not start on time. And the other children had to wait until all the children were in the class, and so they could start their class. So the board of the school got together and said, okay, we have to do something about it. What can we do? And they did what probably 99% of schools would have done. they said, okay, if you drop your child late, you're going to be fined. So they imposed on children, sorry, on parents of the late children, a fine, a monetary fine. You pay if you're late, okay? The result of that was that more parents dropped their children late. And why is that? The fact was that the implicit model of, in this case, the regulation that the school board introduced was the one of the homo economicus, or the monetary man. If you're late, you pay for it, okay? But the assumption that the parents had was, okay, I can be late, but I shouldn't be too late because I'm in a social relationship with the teachers. So there's something has to be preserved. But in the moment in which that became an economic transaction, I can buy my being late, then parents, particularly the wealthiest parents, started to buy time. So they could simply be late and not worry about the kind of social shame of it because they were just paying for it. This is an example how behavioral research is important for policy, because if you get wrong how people behave, policy not only doesn't work, but could produce the opposite outcome, okay? So this is why people like us, but many others, of course, have done behavioral research to help policy design. And I think this issue of how people behave is implicit in any form of design. In my undergrad studies, I was studying psychology back in Italy at the time, and in my faculty, psychology was very much linked with design of ergonomics. So the way how people use interfaces and uses. And one of the issues there was, again, that the way how people conceptualize the average user was a fully rational man. And that created not a small problem. Then, of course, that domain has evolved. We talk about user experience now and other things. But again, there is a common ground there about try to understand what is the model that you're using, the model of how people think and behave for what you're doing. Now, my talk is a bit more, if you want, giving this a bit more about what would be interesting to do next. But first, let's summarize a bit about behavioral research. Now, here I say behavioral economics because, as Cristiano has said, the label that became famous is behavioral economics. But in fact, it means a lot of research, that is psychological research, has been branded as behavioral economics for a number of reasons. And in fact, we have two streams of this research. The one we just discussed about the biases, the heuristics, and is essentially the sort of more cognitive behavioral research. And then we have another one that is a bit less prominent, is about the behavioral economics, which focuses more about how the environment impacts people's behavior, okay? Now, these two, obviously, they're separated here from a kind of analytical point of view, but they are together. But here, people studied how the mind works, so to speak, and how we came to use certain rules, what these rules are. A lot of research has gone into mapping all the biases and heuristics we use. The heuristics, again, are these rules. I mentioned before the social proof, but there are others. Another rule is called which can produce biases, it's called availability. The idea that if we remember something more easily than other things, we tend to overestimate how this thing is frequent in the world. Now, said this way is not very clear, but I'll give you another example. People that watch a lot of TV, for example, those TV shows where they're all lawyers or doctors, okay? If you ask them how many lawyers and doctors there are in society, they overestimate their number massively. This is simply because the availability in their memory of this kind of work is much higher because they are exposed to that kind of content. So a lot of people, a lot of researchers mapped all these heuristics and all these biases that they are out there. Okay. Now, about the environment is a bit of a different story because is the way our internal cognitive mechanism engage with the environment, and they are shaped by the environment. There is a new debate about, I mean, it's very psychological, neuroscience-based, which I won't really go into here, but there is this idea that the fact that we represent in our head concepts and the world in a sort of, a bit like a computer, is not accepted anymore. Is the idea, the metaphor that usually people have used in the past is the hardware is the brain, the software is the mind, okay? This kind of metaphor now is not accepted anymore simply because we have to take in consideration also how the body plays an important role in the way how we think. So the environment is coming back to play a major role in behavioral research. So not focusing only on the cognitive aspects, but also on the kind of sensory, motor, and emotional aspects. On emotions, we could do an entirely dedicated lecture, how these are important. Again, neglected for a long time emotions, we do know that they play an important role in decision-making. Now, since I was asked to talk about big data and more other aspects, these are ideas I just had a few months ago, and I'm pursuing in my own research. The fact that this idea of how people think is now not only the domain of psychology. This dual mode that we think fast and we think slow has pervaded other disciplines. For example, in political science, people are applying this idea on how people vote, how they select candidates, about political behavior. And I was intrigued by the implication of this way of thinking about decision-making for sociology, mainly because now I'm in a sociology department, so it's very instrumental. But I was generally interested in this topic. And the reason is because in sociology, something very interesting is happening. What is happening is that traditionally sociology worked with a population, so a group of people. And the way how you look at populations was through variables like education, all demographic variables, and so on, all this sort of stuff. But what it turns out is that more and more, for many kind of research, demographic variables, they don't tend to distinguish very well group of people anymore. So what is happening is that before, differences between groups that they were clearly different in socio-demographic, they were unproblematic, you would find them, but you cannot catch very well differences within groups, invisible differences within groups. So what is happening is that you see cases of, for example, voting, but other kind of behavior where you would go and look for socio-demographic variables explaining why people have done something, and these socio-demographic don't really explain that. So the question was, okay, how we can start to merge what we know about decision-making and through behavioral research and a more sociological approach. And the idea I had, I mean, it's not only my idea, there is a group of people that they are working on this, is what now goes under the name of cognitive sociology. So the idea that the way how we use, select, heuristics, frames, so all these mental shortcuts are not only an individual decision, but they are shared by our own community in the sense that they help us to kind of, they nudge us to use certain schemas and way of looking at the world more than others. So there is this idea that we essentially, this is particularly true for things like attention. Communities of people pay attention to certain things in the world and not others. So we know that communities are important in shaping the way us, individuals, looking at the world, and they select the way how also take decisions, okay? So cognitive sociology is based on this idea that you can group people based on their socio-demographic, that's the traditional sociology, and other variables like the type of employment they have and so on. But you can also group them based in terms of thought community. This is a very sort of bad lay term. But the idea is communities that they have similar thinking styles, communities that use the same kind of, could be cognitive schemas, a way of interpreting the world. They use the same frames, for example. Now, this is a lot of research is going into this direction, is trying to find a way of doing that. And okay, this is simply reiterating the idea that one way of looking at it is people use frame to interpret reality. Frame can be modified by design, but frames are shared among community members. So just to give you an example, people that voted for a particular outcome in the Brexit referendum, they shared a particular understanding of what is essentially the role of the other, the different people that they are coming from their country, and how they have to position themselves through that. And we got some studies, I mean, some research done on that, which is, I think, very interesting, the results. This stuff predicts the fact that they voted for Brexit much more than traditional variables like their level of education, their employment, or where they are. So the way how they think predicts the way how they voted, so to speak. Now, from a methodological point of view, this is a bit difficult to do. And the reason is because being this sort of research made on communities requires a lot of people to be studied in order to identify these thought communities and to make comparisons. And, okay, these are simply I'll follow up on what I was saying. So the methodology part is, being also in part a methodologist, is also very, very interesting. Now, Cristiano mentioned the idea of big data. Now, big data is, we know, a buzzword. Everybody talks about big data. And big data is not only about numbers. It's not only about the fact that we have a lot of data. But it's also about two things, I would say. One is about the resolution of this data, so the level of details of stuff that we can measure and have data about. So to give you an example, Facebook records how much time you spend on images. Why they do that? Because if you spend more time looking at cats rather than dogs, it kind of infers that probably you are a cat person rather than a dog person. So if Facebook has to tell a company which kind of advertising has to send you, it will send you advertising about cats and not dogs. So it's more relevant to you. So it's also about, and this is just one piece of information that a company like Facebook has. The other point is that, I think it's a bit more methodological, is the idea that we are learning methods coming from computer science, and we are using these methods now to be used for social science research. Now, in social science, traditionally, we had one big problem. We had very few data. And we had very few data because to collect data was very, very expensive. So all the analysis we do are based on what? Of making the best out of a few data. All we do is about making sure, is based on a scarcity principle, is about the idea that we work on samples, we want to make sure that the sample is representative of a population, that you can infer from a sample the fact that, you know, what you're saying about the sample is true about the population and so on. In a big data, you change the perspective because for the first time, you can collect populations. You can collect the entire thing. So the way how you analyze this data is different, and we will see it in a few seconds. There's also another couple of elements that are important. Long data. Now, another big problem in social science has been the fact that we have data that have a very short longitudinal dimension. So in time, we don't have data to see how things evolve in time. Imagine when you do a questionnaire, a survey, you collect it once, that's it. If you are lucky, you can collect several questionnaires once per year. But that's really pretty much what we used to do. So everything that has an important temporal dimension was lost. This is also true in the case of behavioral research to a certain extent. We do experiments, we do it once, we see the effect of something, but we are not able to detect decay, the fact that something works now, but maybe in 2 months it doesn't work anymore. So the fact that the time dimension is now available is why it's available? Because of the availability of data. If I record data continuously, as in the big data context, that means that I have this possibility of recording continuously data, and therefore I can analyze continuously what's going on. So we have, I think we have a change really of a paradigmatic change of how we do research in social science because of big data. That applies also to behavioral research. And now I'll go into a bit more details about this. Now, just one more aspect is that because of what we have now, we have methodological diversity. I mean, we can compare big data experiments, comparative experiments, and so on. We can mix different methodologies that they are coming from different areas. Now, what I said before about data scarcity, the fact that we have very few data, traditionally we had very few data, made it so that all we do in social science is essentially inferential, meaning that, from the particular, we want to go to the general. But what we learn is that the moment in which we have big data, you can change your epistemology. You can add an abductive approach, meaning that you can go with some hypothesis, collect data, and through the data, generate new hypotheses and going on through that. Now, there is a big debate in statistics about this, which obviously only if you read the statistics journal you will get. And it's interesting because, I'll come back to this stuff in a second. Basically, there is this debate about two ways of modeling, doing analysis, called the two cultures of modeling. The one that we essentially use in social science, and they call them the data modeling approach. And then we have something that's has come already from computer science, and they call it the algorithmic approach to modeling. And what is the difference? Well, the difference here is that essentially in the traditional method, what we do is we found what causes what. We have an idea. We have our hypothesis. We select a model that we want to test. And this model is just a matter of defining the model through the data. Okay? In the case of the algorithmic approach, however, the model is unknown. We run a number of methods to determine which model is the best. It's a bit of a technical discussion here, but the question is the model of selection. The idea is, when I have my data and I go and run my regression in social science, the point for me is not to select which model I'm using, but to just estimate the value of the variables in my model. That's what we do. Okay? In the question of the algorithmic turn, is not about estimating the parameters, but it's simply to determine which is my model, which variable should go there. Okay? Now, some people have done that. There is this debate about these two approaches, and one of the big issues here is that model selection becomes important when you have big data because you don't know in advance which variable might be important because you have so many variables. One of the approaches that people have developed is, it comes from classification and regression trees, is the idea that you can look at your data through algorithms that look at which variables are important for your data set to distinguish parts of your data set. And this is what classification and regression trees do. Now, the last example before, how much time do we have? 10 minutes, 10 minutes. Is this idea of model-based recursive portioning. So the idea is that when we do our modeling in social science, the idea is that this model applies to all the data we have. So let's say that I do a survey, I collect my data, I run my regression on this data, and whatever comes out of this regression applies to all the data in my survey, okay? So I have, for example, a sample of 1,000 people. My regression is based on 1,000 people. Now, this approach hides a problem. The problem is that there might be a group of people within these 1,000 people in which my model doesn't work. Or it works in a different way compared to others. But because of the way how regressions are made, this will not show up. Okay? Now, this approach, what it does is it creates a system in which you have your regression and it tests the regression in groups of your data set. So it will look at groups of your 1,000 people to look if your model works for everyone. And if it doesn't work, it will tell you why and what characteristics these people have. And therefore, we move from a global way of doing the analysis to local models that they will tell you subgroups of people that they have specific way, or they can be explained by specific variation of the model that you started with. Now, why this sounds very complicated, but why this is important? Well, what it is telling you is that I can go and have 10,000 people, and I have a regression and try to explain why these people, for example, decided to vaccinate their children or not. And what I can find is not one model that explains all the 10,000 people, which will not do a good job, but rather, running a method like this, what we'll create is groups of people that will say, well, for this group of people, this variable is more important than others. For this other group of people, this variable is more important than others. So it will tell you essentially how the diversity within the population can be explained by your model. Now that fits very well the idea of thought communities and cognitive sociology at the beginning. So the idea that rather than having a model that explains how everyone behaves, I found groups of people that might behave differently, and I can detect that statistically using this methodology. Now, I skipped the more technical part. I had some example here which are not pertinent here, but the outcome that you have is something like this, where you can show that your population, your model is different from male to female and from female of one type or the other in terms of marital status, and so on. This is just a very simple example. So it can reproduce your model and splitting the population based on some covariates so that you can identify subgroups of people. And just to give you an example, this is the beta 0, beta 1, beta 2. These are the typical things you find in a regression, okay? So these are groups. 2, 4, and 5 are different groups of people. So B1 would be, let's say, a variable. Let's say, for example, we are measuring the fact that people take on or not vaccination, okay? So B1 is the level of education. Level of education is very important for the first group, but is not for the second group. And it is for the third group, but in a different direction. So what it's showing you is the same model works for everyone, but the value of the variables changes according to the group of people. So this methodology is something that is coming from computer science and is being now applied to social science in something that is called computational social science. It's the way how you can apply mathematics that was developed in the computer science domain to the case of social science. And why this is important? It's important because if you apply methods like this, and there are others, I mean, obviously I can give you more information if you want to, but the idea is that we are moving from this idea that because we have very few data, we have to find one explanation, one model that fits all. But because now we have a lot of data, we can go into the details. And of course, this method works well with what? With big data. Because obviously, to split your data in subgroups, you need to have a lot of data. Because if you have 100 people, you don't want to explain a group of 5 or 10 people. But if you have tens of thousands, potentially millions, then that applies. And that's why this comes from computer science, because they were initially developed to deal with very large amount of data. So where I'm going at is that at the moment, when we do behavioral research, we do it on fairly limited number, because often behavioral research is done in laboratory. But more and more people can do it online. And when you do it online, the numbers goes up of people that can participate to a behavioral study. When you start to have thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions, there was some time ago a rather controversial experiment done by Facebook and Princeton University, in which the control group was 500,000 people, and the other experimental group was another 500,000 people. And what they did was they changed the amount of positive and negative, let's say, emotions expressed in text in the Facebook news feed for people to see how they would react without telling anyone. That was the controversial bit. So people were enrolled in these experiments without knowing it. They were mainly American users of Facebook, but still, well, they have a different privacy law now. But so the idea was, if you have 500,000 participants in an experiment, you cannot run the statistics you used before. And that's where these computational methods come in, because they deal very well with the fact that you have 500,000. You cannot find a model that fits 500,000 individuals. Now, there is, of course, in all these methods about computational methods, then machine learning and so on, there are other technical debates about fitting, overfitting, and so on. But the idea here is that behavioral research is becoming something that is borrowing from computational sciences, is expanding its domain of analysis, is getting out from laboratory to much larger populations, and therefore has the potential to analyze not just little groups of individuals, but to become something that can be used to segment, and if you want, although the term is not very popular these days, profile population rather than just a small group of people. So if I can identify through these methods, through the approach of cognitive sociology and the background of behavioral science, the fact that certain groups of certain people use certain cognitive schemas to make decisions, that's something that it helps me a lot about policy design. Why? And I'll give you an example. We've done a study recently, well, project that is finished recently on a European project, where we look exactly at these sort of topics. And what we found is that There is a group of people in Europe, we've done this research in several countries, that is characterized by anomia, the willingness not to engage with the world. You know, I don't care, nothing matters if you know, it doesn't matter what I do, nothing changes. This sort of approach, which has obviously a psychological definition that is more precise. Now, imagine that you are a mayor of a city, and you find out through an analysis like this that you have a big chunk of your population is like that. And you want to impose a policy that requires engagement of citizens to work, for example, recycling. It's not going to work because you have this kind of people that will not engage no matter what. It doesn't matter if you give them economic incentive, you make your trash can yellow or blue or all the typical nudges you can use. Because you have a community that is characterized by a particular set of cognitive schemas that will not allow you to engage. On the other hand, you might have people that they are very engaging, and you can use those in those cases. So my final message is that behavioral research is something that is not anymore the domain of psychology. The first, if you want, domain of invasion was economics. That's why it became behavioral economics. Psychologists essentially discussed the taken for granted assumption in economics about how people make economic decisions. That's why Daniel Kahneman, 2001, a psychologist, won the Nobel Prize in economics. But that then is expanding to a lot of other domains. I think there is a lot of very interesting stuff in political science, for example, applying behavioral research. And the same applies to sociology and other domains. So the issue here is that it's not something that you should be interested because, okay, it's something cool to know. It's something that belongs to whatever you do, as soon as you're working with people, essentially. And because obviously if you're doing chemistry, perhaps you're not that much interest. But in the case of dealing with people, you have to know now what is the current state of knowledge about how people take decisions. And of course, this is ongoing research. Things happen all the time. I mean, it's not something fixed. A lot of stuff is happening in the way how we link emotions with decision making. This is also a very important issue. Emotion always been considered, the sort of the black sheep. I mean, the thing that you want to exclude because emotion mess with the mind. If you think about science fiction, Spock and all these other characters, that they were emotionless, and because of that, they could take the right decision. It turns out, actually, it's the opposite. People that have emotional problems, I mean, meaning they don't feel emotions, they are really bad at taking decisions. There's the work of a famous neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, and others who worked in this direction, put, again, emotion into the picture, how that plays a role in decision-making. I think the aspect of behavioral research that has been so far a deficit is the fact that a lot of these studies are about individual decision-making, how people take decisions alone. And people don't take decisions alone. They are part of networks, social networks, and I don't mean just the online social networks. We are part of relationships with others. The idea of cognitive sociology is the idea we are part of communities from which we are born, and we're introduced to a particular way of thinking and pressure out of it. So there are other sort of things to take into account. And I'll stop here because I'll probably be too long. Thank you.